The verdict had already been written before anyone sat down. Everyone in the convocation hall knew it. The 17 delegations seated in their tiered rings above the central stage knew it. The neutral observers packed into the upper gallery knew it. Even the young human diplomat named Caro knew it, because his hands had not stopped shaking since the second day of the trial, and this was the 21st. Only Admiral Nora Vale did not seem to know it. Or if she did, she had decided not to care. She sat at the human delegation table on the central stage with her hands folded and her back straight, and an expression on her face that did not belong in a room like this. It was not anger. It was not grief. It was not the careful blankness of a diplomat trying to project calm. It was something quieter than all of those things. It was the look of a person waiting for a kettle to boil. Patient. Certain. Completely elsewhere in her mind. High Arbiter Drael stood at the head of the chamber. He was tall even by Surukai standards, with 6 limbs folded against his body in the formal posture of judgment, and he had spent 3 weeks building toward this moment. He read from the formal declaration in a slow, deliberate voice that filled every corner of the hall. Unauthorized expansion into 12 contested systems. Suppression of 3 pre-contact species. Refusal to submit to council oversight for 11 consecutive review cycles. Development and deployment of weapons classified under Existential Category 4. He paused between each charge, letting the silence do its work. The gallery was absolutely still. The punishment followed. Immediate suspension of all human faster-than-light travel rights. Seizure of 7 border colonies to be administered under council authority. Full military disarmament within 60 days, to be monitored and enforced by a joint council fleet. 400 warships, already positioned beyond the edge of human space, waiting for the order. Caro leaned toward Nora and whispered that they needed to say something. File an objection. Request an appeal. Anything. He said the word anything twice. Nora did not look at him. She was watching Drael with that quiet expression, and she did not move. Drael finished the declaration and set down his document. He looked at the human table with the particular satisfaction of someone who has been working toward a moment for a very long time and has finally arrived at it. He asked, as was required by council procedure, whether the human delegation wished to make a final statement before the verdict was formalized. It was a formality. Everyone knew that too. No one expected a real answer. Nora stood up. She did not pick up her datapad. She did not unfold a prepared speech. She set her datapad face down on the table, looked slowly around the entire chamber, taking her time, meeting eyes where eyes could be met, and then she said 6 words in a voice that was perfectly level and completely unhurried. You chose the wrong week. Then she sat back down. The chamber did not erupt. It went in the other direction entirely. It went so quiet that the ventilation hum became the loudest thing in the room. Caro stared at her. His mouth was open. Drael's expression moved through several things quickly before settling on controlled fury. He asked, in a voice stripped of its ceremony, what exactly that was supposed to mean. Nora did not answer. Her wristcom pulsed once. A soft blue light, there and gone. She glanced down at it, and the quiet expression on her face shifted, just slightly, just for a moment, into something that was unmistakably a smile. She looked back up at Drael and said nothing. Drael began to respond. He got 3 words out. Then the lights changed. Every display in the convocation hall flickered. The holographic stage stuttered, went dark, came back. The overhead panels dimmed for exactly 4 seconds and returned. The delegates in the upper rings looked at each other. The neutral observers shifted in their seats. The displays came back one by one. The procedural feeds, the translation overlays, the administrative panels. All of them returning to normal except for one. The deep space sensor feed that ran along the far wall of the chamber, a long horizontal strip showing the surrounding system in pale blue and white, had not returned to its previous image. It showed something else now. Something at the edge of the system that had not been there 4 seconds ago. The tactical officer seated behind the Surukai delegation was the first to notice it. He stood up from his chair without meaning to. His voice, when he spoke, came out much quieter than he intended. He said he was reading multiple contacts. Unknown configuration. Unknown registry. No identification signals. At the system perimeter. Someone in the gallery asked how many. The tactical officer looked at his screen. He looked at it for a long time before he answered. because the number on his screen did not match anything he had prepared himself to see today. He said he was still counting. Nora folded her hands on the table in front of her, exactly as they had been before. She waited. The number kept changing. That was the problem. Every time the Council's tactical officers updated their sensor sweep, the contact count revised upward. First it was dozens. Then it crossed 100. Then the officer tracking it stopped reporting the numbers aloud because the chamber was already too loud and none of his superiors were listening to him anyway. They were all talking over each other in 5 different languages, hands moving, chairs scraping, the careful architecture of the session completely gone. Nora sat in all of it like a stone in a river. Karo had stopped whispering. He was just watching her now, the way you watch someone who has done something you do not yet understand. 3 years earlier, there had been a room beneath the Martian shelf, not a large room, not a comfortable one, with concrete walls and a single overhead light and a table that had been scratched by every person who had ever sat at it. Director Haas had chosen it specifically because it was the most thoroughly boring room in any human government facility, and boring rooms did not attract attention. Haas was old. He had been old when Nora first met him, and he had not improved since. He walked with a cane he resented and read without glasses he also resented, and he had spent 40 years doing the kind of work that never appeared in any official record. He sat across from Nora in that scratch table room and laid out what the intelligence teams had confirmed, piece by piece, without drama, the way a man lays out evidence in a room with no audience. The Council had been building toward this trial for 7 years. Not because humanity had actually suppressed contact species. The evidence for that had been assembled, not discovered. Not because human weapons programs crossed any real line. The classification criteria had been adjusted specifically to include human systems that had been legal the year before. The trial was not about law. It was about arithmetic. Human population growth, industrial output, fleet production rates. The Council's own projections showed that within 40 years, humanity would be ungovernable by any external body. The trial was not a verdict. It was a deadline. Submit now, Haas told her, while it still looks like law. Or don't submit, and find out what that costs. Nora had asked what the alternative was. Haas had told her, be ready before the deadline arrives. 2 years and 4 months before the trial, she walked through a construction facility built inside a hollowed-out asteroid in the outer belt. There were 3 facilities like it. None of them existed on any registered survey. Engineer Solis walked beside her with a tablet full of production numbers and the expression of someone who had not slept sufficiently in 18 months and had made peace with this fact. The ships going into the Void Fleet were not the biggest humanity had ever built. Solis was clear about that. They were not designed to impress anyone on a parade ground. Every system had been rebuilt from scratch, incorporating a century of combat data, stress analysis, and the specific tactical lessons of every engagement humanity had ever studied, its own and everyone else's. The newest vessel in the fleet was 22 months old. Not one component came from a supplier with Council trade ties. Not one worker on any of the 3 facilities had an outside communications channel. Thousands of people, years of work, complete silence. 8 months before the trial, the Void Fleet ran its final tests in a system 3 jumps beyond the edge of Council sensor range. Nora walked the observation deck of the fleet flagship, the UNSV Judgment, and watched 840 warships hold formation in the dark. Solis messaged her that all systems were green across every vessel. She sent back a single word, good. Then she got on a shuttle and went to a trial she had known for 3 years she would never lose. Back in the convocation hall, Drail's voice cut through the noise. He had recovered enough of himself to be authoritative again, and he was demanding a final contact count from his tactical team. The officer gave it to him. 840 warships, human-built, holding position at the system perimeter. No IFF signal, no communication. Just there, in a long silent mass, waiting. The chamber absorbed the number the way a structure absorbs a crack. Quietly at first, then in ways that could not be contained. Drail turned from the sensor display to the human table. His voice, when he spoke, was stripped all the way down to its frame. He told Nora this was an act of war. She agreed that it was. He asked her what she expected to gain from this, whether she understood what the Council could bring against her, whether she had thought about what happened next. Nora looked at him across the chamber floor with that same patient expression. She told him that thinking about what happened next was the only thing humanity had been doing for the past 3 years. Then she asked if the council would like to hear the counteroffer. Drayle did not accept the counteroffer. He told Nora that there would be no negotiation under the threat of military force. He told her that the council did not recognize coercion as a legitimate diplomatic instrument. He told her that the joint enforcement fleet positioned outside human space would begin its advance immediately, and that if human warships attempted to interfere, the consequences would be total. He said all of this with great authority and then turned to his communications officer and gave the order. The enforcement fleet received it 11 seconds later. Admiral Brin commanded the 400 warships from his bridge. He was a careful officer, a Sarukai who had spent 30 years in council service without making the kind of mistake that ended careers, and who had been given this assignment precisely because careful officers do not cause incidents. His orders were clear: advance on human colonial space, establish blockade positions, and hold until the disarmament inspection teams were ready to deploy. It was not a combat mission. It was a show of force. He had done this before with smaller fleets and softer targets, and it had always worked. He brought his fleet to transit speed and began the advance. He did not know about the dead moon. It was not large enough to appear on most standard survey maps, a frozen, airless rock orbiting a gas giant 2 light hours from the council fleet's staging position. It had no mineral value, no strategic significance, no reason for anyone to be interested in it. It had, however, an extremely useful sensor shadow on its far side, a region where emissions did not carry, where a ship running with its drives cold and its hull absorbing rather than reflecting could sit indefinitely without being detected by any passive sensor array the council used. 41 human warships had been parked there for 11 days. Similar situations existed inside 3 asteroid fields, inside the upper atmosphere of the gas giant itself, and in a stretch of debris cloud that drifted slowly through the region on a long orbital arc. The total number of human vessels holding silent inside Brin's operating area was 240. They had been watching his fleet's patrol patterns since they arrived. They knew his rotation schedule. They knew which ships carried command functions. They knew the exact moment his fleet committed to the advance, because they were watching his formation shift in real time. Captain Darasolt commanded the group behind the dead moon. She was not a grand person. She did not make speeches. She ran a tight ship in the particular way of officers who believe that a crew that knows its job should not need to be constantly reminded of it. When the encrypted signal arrived, a timestamp, nothing more, she read it, checked her clock, and told her crew to begin the countdown. She did not tell them to be heroes. She told them to be accurate. 11 minutes and 40 seconds later, it was over. 240 human warships came out of their hiding positions from 17 different vectors simultaneously and executed a targeting sequence that had been planned, rehearsed, and war-gamed for 8 months. They did not fire on hulls. They did not target life support or crew compartments. Every strike hit drive systems, weapons arrays, and communication relays with a precision that was not accidental and was not luck. The Council Enforcement Fleet did not fight back. It did not have time to fight back. By the time Brin understood what was happening, his ship's drive was already gone and his weapons were already offline, and the first damage reports were coming in from across his formation. He sent emergency signals. He called for support. He requested instructions from the convocation hall. None of those signals reached anyone in useful time. In the hall, the communication channels went from routine status traffic to chaos in under 30 seconds. Brin's voice came through first, clipped, professional, a man reporting the unthinkable without losing his composure entirely. Then other voices, from other ships, reporting the same thing in less controlled tones. Drives gone. Weapons offline. Life support nominal. No casualties confirmed. Unable to maneuver. 400 warships floating dead in space. Drayle stood at the front of the chamber and heard it all. Nora sat at the human table and also heard it all, and did not move, and did not change her expression, because she had already heard it in her head many times in the past 3 years, and the real version matched her expectations closely enough that there was nothing to react to. When the reports finished, when Brin's final status transmission confirmed that the entire enforcement fleet was disabled and holding, the chamber was silent in a different way than it had been before. Before, the silence had been political. Performed. The silence of people who know the outcome and are waiting for it to be formalized. This silence was structural. The silence of people whose understanding of their situation has just been completely revised. Drayle turned from the communications panel to look at Nora. She looked back at him and waited, the way she had been waiting all day, patient and unhurried. With 840 warships holding position at the system perimeter and 240 more sitting among the wreckage of his enforcement fleet. She asked, for the second time, whether the council would like to hear the counteroffer. This time, Drayle sat down. Nora did not raise her voice once. People assumed it must have been a confrontation, demands delivered across a table, the energy of a species that had just disabled 400 warships wanting to make its power felt. It was not that. It was methodical. It was almost quiet. The most efficient 6 hours of diplomacy Caro had ever witnessed, and he had been at the table for 11 years. Nora produced a document. She slid it to the center of the table in physical hard copy. Paper, not a datapad, because paper could not be remotely wiped, edited, or disputed after the fact. The document was called the Strategic Realignment Accord. It was 43 pages. Fully drafted, legally reviewed, translated into all 17 council languages before the trial's first session 3 weeks ago. Caro realized, reading the date on the header, that it had been prepared 9 months earlier. The terms were not punitive. That was the second thing that surprised the room. The council representatives had arranged themselves in their seats expecting to be carved up, territory taken, reparations demanded, council authority formally dissolved. The accord did none of that. It recognized human sovereignty over all currently inhabited human systems without condition. It voided the seizure clauses and the disarmament order. It established a joint oversight committee for new species contact protocols, which was actually a reasonable idea that humanity had proposed twice before through proper channels and been refused. The difference now was a single clause. Humans would chair it. Drayle objected to the chair clause. Nora told him that the chair clause was not negotiable and moved on before he could respond. She came to the section on the 3 pre-contact species, the centerpiece of the council's case against humanity, the evidence that had looked most damning in front of the gallery observers. She explained that the evidence was fabricated. She did not say this with anger. She said it the way a technician explains why a machine failed. Here is the component. Here is what was done to it. Here is how it was supposed to look. Here is how it actually looks. And here is the record of who changed it. The original survey files were in the Accord's appendix. 19 months of contact protocol logs, untouched, showing not suppression of pre-contact species, but careful, cautious monitoring exactly in line with council standards. The falsified version, the one that had been presented at trial, had been altered at the source level, which required access to council data infrastructure that only a small number of people possessed. Counselor Ivan possessed it. Ivan sat in his seat and said nothing while Nora described, in the same quiet and organized tone, 19 separate violations of council law traceable to his office. Fraud. Fabrication of intelligence used in judicial proceedings. Unauthorized covert operations inside sovereign human space. And at the bottom of the list, 2 deaths, human diplomatic couriers, 7 years ago, ruled as piracy by the council investigative body that Ivan had also overseen. Not piracy. Ivan's people had done it. The names of the couriers were in the document. Drayle asked why humanity had not brought this evidence forward before. Nora told him they had. 3 times. Formal submission through proper channels. The first submission was lost. The second was reviewed and closed without finding. The third was reviewed by a body that reported to Ivan. After the third submission, humanity started building the Void Fleet. From the far side of the table, a voice spoke that had not spoken before. Delegate Orion represented the Vestan Compact, a smaller council member that had always sat toward the middle politically. She asked, carefully, whether she could see the original evidence files directly, not the summary, the raw files. Nora gave her a separate hard copy. Orion read. The chamber waited. Nobody tried to fill the silence while she read, because everyone in the room understood that her reaction was going to matter. She was the first delegate who was treating the accord as something to be evaluated rather than resisted, and the room could feel it. After a long time, Orion set the document down. She did not look at Ivan. She said she needed a recess to contact her government. Drayle called the recess. While the chamber emptied, Nora passed the full negotiation to Caro, who moved into the detailed legal language of the Accord's implementation clauses with the focused efficiency of a man who had read every word at least 30 times and knew where every line of leverage was. Nora stood at the chamber window and looked out into the dark. The Void Fleet was invisible from here. Too far out, too dark, no running lights. But she knew exactly where it was. 840 warships, holding position, holding silence, burning nothing but patience. Her wristcom lit up. A message from Director Haas. For words. Any trouble up there? She typed back 3. Not yet. Good. She put the comm away and kept watching the dark, and when the chamber doors opened again and the delegations began filing back in, she walked back to the table and sat down. 3 delegations had signaled private support for the Accord during the recess. Drayle saw their faces when they returned. He understood what was happening. He looked across the chamber at Nora with an expression that had something complicated in it, still hostile, still proud, but with something underneath that was beginning to look a lot like realization. Orion made a formal motion to open the evidence files to the full council. The vote passed 11-6. The image that spread across the galaxy was not what anyone expected. Every civilization monitoring the situation had positioned observers in or near the convocation hall system. They expected to relay footage of warships, disabled fleets, the visual language of power, fire and hull breach, and the dramatic evidence of superior force applied to inferior resistance. That footage existed. Sensor recordings of 240 human vessels emerging from 17 positions simultaneously were already moving through the networks. And yes, they were watched, and yes, they caused significant re-evaluation in a significant number of government buildings across 14 civilizations. But the image that people kept returning to was a different one. A Thessan journalist named Vin had been embedded in the neutral observer gallery since the second day of the trial. She had press credentials from a legitimate outlet, and she had been doing something the other observers were not. She had kept her recording equipment running on the human delegation table for the entire session, not because she expected anything to happen there, but because she had a sense about the woman in the gray uniform who never looked worried. The feed going out live to her 14-subscriber network showed Nora Vale sitting at a negotiating table in a plain gray uniform, speaking in a level voice about fabricated evidence and falsified survey logs, while 6 hours of multi-civilization diplomacy happened around her. No raised voice, no visible satisfaction, no theater, just a person doing a job that had been prepared very thoroughly and was now being completed on schedule. That image, that specific quality of calm, was the thing that traveled. Governments that had considered humanity a manageable problem began calling emergency meetings. Not because of the warships. Warships could be counted, studied, planned against. What could not be easily planned against was a species that had built 840 warships in complete secrecy, over years, without a single intelligence leak, while simultaneously preparing a 43-page legal document, staging 240 additional ships inside an enemy operating area for 11 days undetected, and sending one representative to sit in a trial chamber for 3 weeks with the answer already in her pocket. And that representative had not even looked impatient. Aboard the UNSV Judgment, Captain Solt was handing off watch rotation to the incoming relief crew. Her ships were maintaining quiet observation over the disabled Council fleet, not threatening, not withdrawing, simply present. A young officer on the relief crew asked Solt, while reviewing the handoff logs, whether she thought they were going to end up in a real war over this. Solt looked at the question seriously. She leaned on the console and looked at the sensor display showing 400 Dark Council ships scattered across the patrol zone. She said that what happened today was the war. The officer did not follow. She told him to think about it. 240 ships, undetected for 11 days, inside a 400-ship fleet's operating area. The Council sent an enforcement action. Humanity replied by disabling the entire force in under 12 minutes, without a single hull breach, without a single life lost on either side. That was not a skirmish. That was a message, and the message was not, "We can hurt you." The message was, "We chose not to." She left him with that, and went to file her post-action report. In the convocation hall, The negotiations were entering their final hours. Drayle had stopped objecting to the Accord's major terms. He was negotiating implementation timelines now, smaller ground, defensive ground, the kind of territory you fight for when the main position is already lost. Caro handled him with the patient technical fluency of a man who had read every word of every clause and was not going to be outmaneuvered on language. During a short break in the session, Drayle moved away from the main table. Nora was standing near the window. He walked to her, and he asked her, off the record, quietly, without ceremony, how long they had known. How long humanity had been specifically preparing for this specific scenario. Nora thought about it genuinely, which was not what he expected. She told him that humanity had not prepared for this scenario. Humanity had prepared for everything. The Void Fleet was not built because someone predicted this exact trial on this exact date. It was built because this trial, or something like it, was always going to happen eventually. She said it the way you state a fact about weather, not with bitterness, just with certainty. She told him, put a species that breeds as fast as humans, works as hard as humans, and holds on to memory as long as humans do into a galaxy run by a council that has never had to compete for anything. And you get this. It was not a surprise. It was a schedule. Drayle was quiet for a long time. Then he said something that moved through the room, and through Vin's live feed, still running, and was heard by 14 civilizations within the hour. He said, we should have talked to you sooner. Nora looked at him. For the first time all day, something in her expression softened very slightly, not into warmth, exactly, but into something adjacent to it. The look of a person who has just heard something true that arrived too late to change anything. She said, yes, you should have. Vin's feed stayed on Nora's face for 3 full seconds after that. Those 3 seconds were replayed, in the following weeks, more than any footage of any warship in any system. Ivan did not make a statement. That was noted by everyone and commented on by no one directly, because the session had moved well past the point where Ivan's opinions carried any procedural weight. He sat in his chair for the signing ceremony with the stillness of a person who has understood, with great clarity, the full extent of their situation and is deciding not to make it worse. He would be referred to the Council's internal justice body before the end of the week. The evidence Nora had compiled was specific, documented, and not going anywhere. The Strategic Realignment Accord was signed by 11 of the 17 Council delegations. The remaining 6 did not vote against it. They abstained, which was, under the circumstances, a form of agreement that no one felt the need to call out. Drayle signed for the Surukai, last among the 11, and he did so without speaking, with a hand that was steady. After the signatures were complete, and the accord was formally entered into the record, the chamber released into something that was not quite celebration and not quite relief. People stood up slowly. Small conversations started. The neutral observer gallery began to empty. Caro shook hands with Delegate Orion, who had made the evidence motion that broke the coalition, and said something that made her nod seriously. Director Haas found Nora in a side corridor off the main chamber. He had arrived from Earth 2 days earlier, once the deal was clearly going to close, and spent those 2 days watching the negotiation feeds and eating the same meal 3 times because it was available and the alternatives required decisions. He walked slowly, and he carried his cane with the air of someone performing a specific ongoing protest against it. He told her she had done well. She told him the hard part was starting now. He asked what she meant. She said that before today, the galaxy thought it knew humanity's ceiling, roughly how many ships humans could build, how far human reach extended. Today that ceiling was gone. Every government with a military planning division would spend the next 5 years running projections on what humanity was actually capable of, and the projections were going to be alarming, and alarmed governments had a limited set of responses. Haas was quiet. Then he said, "Then we need them to understand us well enough not to try." That was the problem in one sentence, and they both knew it, and neither of them had an answer for it yet. They walked back toward the chamber in silence. Drayle was waiting near the main doors. He had one final question. He asked it directly, without preamble. The political ceremony was over and he seemed, for the first time in the weeks Nora had known of him, to be speaking plainly. The Void Fleet was still at the system perimeter. When was it going to leave? Nora told him it was not going to leave. The Void Fleet would maintain a permanent presence in neutral space as a standing element of the Accord's enforcement framework, not positioned against any specific civilization, not targeting anyone, simply present, a physical fact, the way a border marker is a physical fact. Drayle asked what it was supposed to remind them of. Nora said, that we were here, and that we were paying attention. He left without responding to that, which was a response of its own kind. She took a transport up to the Judgment the following morning. The flagship was not the largest ship in the fleet. That distinction belonged to two of the heavy carriers anchored at the formation center, but it was where she had signed the readiness report 8 months ago, and she preferred it for that reason. It felt, in a way that was difficult to explain and that she did not try to explain, like the right place to be. She stood on the observation deck and looked out. 840 warships stretched across the dark in long, quiet lines, running lights minimal, drives cold, holding position the way they had been holding it for weeks. No movement, no restlessness, just the fleet, present and still, in the silence between stars. A message arrived on her wristcom from Earth. It was a data summary from the Office of Strategic Preparation, a routine transmission, sent on the standard schedule, covering things that did not feel routine at all. Population growth figures for the past year. Industrial output across the belt facilities. Projected capacity numbers for the construction yards that had built the Void Fleet, now that secrecy was no longer a constraint. The last line was fleet production rates for the coming fiscal year. She read the number. She read it twice. Then she put the comm in her pocket and looked back out at 840 warships holding position in the dark, and she thought about the governments right now running their projections, counting her ships, trying to calculate what humanity's ceiling looked like. They were looking at the fleet. They thought they were looking at the ceiling. The Void Fleet was not the result of humanity reaching its limit. It was what humanity had produced while trying to be quiet about it, in facilities that could not operate at full output, over a timeline compressed by the need for secrecy. It was the floor. Nora stood on the observation deck of the Judgment and looked at the fleet she had built and thought about the floor, and somewhere on her face, small, controlled, not for anyone else, was the same quiet smile she had been wearing since her wristcom pulsed blue in a chamber where a verdict had already been written. The stars held their positions. So did the fleet.